Welcome to the CoinStories podcast, where we talk about investing, hard money, Bitcoin, and how technology is revolutionizing the global economy. I'm Natalie Brunell, and I'm here to learn with you. So this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. None of the discussions should constitute as official investment advice, and you should always do your own research. This show is made possible through partnerships with companies I trust, and I'm very picky about who I partner with. So I hope you take the time to listen to the ad reads throughout the show. First up, Swan. I partnered with Swan because it is a Bitcoin-only company that is focused on helping people save for their future and self-custody their Bitcoin. Swan can help you start a direct deposit to take advantage of Bitcoin as a savings technology and learn how to take it off the exchange. Swan's mission is to educate 10 million future Bitcoiners through free resources and media projects like the Hard Money Show. Swan also offers retirement planning with an IRA, tax loss harvesting, and a white glove private client service. I use Swan to dollar cost average, and I deposit a little bit every day that's equivalent to what I might spend on a meal so that I add to my future nest egg and lower my yearly cost basis. Swan Studios produces my hard money news reports, simplifying Bitcoin for mass audiences and documenting Bitcoin adoption around the world. To learn more and get $10 in free Bitcoin, head to swanbitcoin.com/Natalie Brunell. All right, next up, Bitcoin Conference 2024. The world's largest Bitcoin event is headed to Nashville next year. Early bird tickets are now available, and this is the lowest cost you'll be able to secure for the conference all year. And if you use the code HODL, HODL, you'll get an extra 10% off. So come join us for 3 great days of networking events, panels, keynotes, workshops, and more. You never know what big name might be announced when tickets are much, much higher in price. Head to b.tc/conference and use the code HODL. I'll see you there. Welcome back. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. I am so excited to have with me David Marcus, CEO of Lightspark. David, thank you so much for joining me on the show. I'm so excited to learn more about your company and your backstory.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So I read that you were born in Paris and you grew up in Switzerland. So let's start at the very beginning. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing.
So yes, that is correct. I was born in Paris and grew up in Paris until my early teens, and then as a family we moved to Switzerland, and that's where I basically grew up, and had a pretty comfortable childhood until we had a family event of losing everything, and then I had to basically just drop out of college and start working. And because I was in Switzerland, I started my career, of course, in a bank, because that's what you do when you're in Switzerland.
Oh, can you share a little bit more about that? Because I can actually relate. I'm a first generation immigrant from Poland. My family lost everything in the great financial crisis here. So what was your family story?
Well, it was, unlike, probably your family history, in this case, it was kind of self-inflicted, but, it was a process of just rebuilding at a perfect age, frankly, because this was an age where I had the ability to actually get the drive that I guess, turned me into the entrepreneur that I've become. From that whole adventure. So it was a net positive experience in hindsight, actually.
I do always believe that struggle builds confidence and struggle builds strength. So,
Agreed.
and we're going through some of that in this bear market. So how did you view money when you were young?
I didn't think too much about it. I felt like, I was kind of more focused on, building things. I was an early geek of sorts in a place where you didn't have a lot of people who were really focused on technology. So, in that sense, I feel like, I was always more focused on building rather than on, money. And I find that, the most successful entrepreneurs end up being successful money-wise because they focused on solving a problem, not the other way around.
So you said that you ended up working for a bank. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey, your career path, and how it ultimately led you to PayPal and Facebook?
Yeah, sure. So interestingly enough, the bank, I was young and I started as an intern in a back office department of a bank. And at the time, and that's going to date me, but at the time they didn't even have PCs. So we had mainframes. And basically, I took it upon myself to start installing PCs everywhere, despite the fact that it wasn't my job description. The official IT team didn't enjoy that, but I felt like, it was time for a little bit of a revolution. So, and so I did a number of departments. I, spent time in the FX department for a while, which was kind of formative for me and interesting. But it felt very theoretical to me. It felt like, really not building something that was actually solving a problem for anyone. So, I left and I started my first company. And my first company was actually an ISP telco company in Switzerland when the market opened up to competition. So in late 1995, early 96, the market started opening up in Switzerland. And I felt like, I was 23 at the time. And I felt like, I had to right a wrong of having, welcoming more competition for businesses at the time in the Swiss market. So that's what I did, and that was my first company. It was called GTN Telecom, and I knew almost nothing about telcos and ISPs. But kind of figured it out on the go. Got a loan from the actual bank that I worked at to get started, and that's how I started my entrepreneurial journey.
And that was really during the dot-com bubble.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy actually, because at the time we basically had all of these companies rolling out fiber all over Europe, and it was a real bubble for the telcos and the ISPs as well. And so it went from having an offer to basically list the company at a 3 billion euro valuation to selling the company for less than $100 million in stock, and that company being listed on the NASDAQ going belly up in the 12 months of my lockup, and me netting basically nothing. And so
Wow.
this was an interesting experience of not selling for stock and building the next one.
Wow. So you know how to ride the waves of volatility. I'm sure you're seeing parallels maybe between that market and sort of the bubble that happened with the last 2 years and how they blew up a bubble financially.
Yeah, I think that, the lesson is actually that you need to build something of value. If you don't build something of value and you just ride the speculative highs, then, eventually the cycle ends, and so will your company or the valuation that you had ascribed to what you were working on.
So how did you get involved with payments? What led you ultimately? It was first PayPal, right? And then you ended up at Facebook, which turned into Meta.
Yeah, it was even before PayPal actually. So the next company after I had sold this first company was actually a company that connected to mobile operators to facilitate eventually what became mobile payments. And then I sold that company that was called Zong to PayPal, and a few months after I had being acquired, and I joined the company to run the mobile part of the business. The then CEO at the time left to become the CEO of Yahoo, and I was like, okay, great. Now I'm going to go back to building something for myself again. But I got offered the job to go lead PayPal in a period where it needed a lot of transformation, and I did that for a number of years. But then got the itch to go building products again, and my initial instinct was actually to go back to building a new company for myself again. But Mark Zuckerberg basically convinced me to join him at Facebook at first to start, working on messaging, which I did for almost 4 years, which was a lot of fun actually, building Messenger from 100 and some million users to 1.5 billion users, building a business model for messaging in the West. That was a lot of fun, and working with Mark and honestly the most talented group of engineers they ever worked with. So this was a lot of fun, and that was just right before starting the Libra journey, basically.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear a little bit about that. It really is incredible to think about how transformative Facebook has been to all of our lives. And I remember it coming out when I was just going into college. So I remember signing up. It was around the year 2005. At the time, it was just certain colleges had it, and then it started to expand more. Suddenly, all of our parents and our grandparents are on it. Frankly, I don't really use Facebook anymore. I've migrated to Twitter and some of the other platforms, but It's truly amazing how big that company is and how much it touches all of our lives to be able to connect us. So they tried to create a cryptocurrency, Libra. What can you share about that?
Well, so, this came from a deeply rooted frustration, for the lack of a better term, of mine around the lack of existence of a true protocol for money on the internet. And this idea that, money moves the same way it moved in the 60s, basically over ACH, over Swift. It's not real time. In the case of ACH, it's 3 days. In the case of Swift, it's a messaging system that enables settlement through correspondent banking. And that has been the reality of how money moves since basically the 60s and 70s. And so there's just no way to move money in the same way that you send a text message or you send an email. There's no, I made that parallel the other day on Twitter. There's no parallel to SMTP for money. There's no protocol for payments on the internet. And so early on in 2018, late 2017, early 2018, I got that itch again to go try to build on payments again and solve that problem that wasn't still resolved, wasn't solved. And so my pitch was actually, okay, let's leverage the fact that Facebook reaches 3.5 billion people every month to build something that will be adopted by other companies that can actually use this open standard for payments on the internet. And we actually spent time looking at Lightning in the early 2018. And
Really?
yeah, we looked at Lightning as one of the ways to do this, but it just wasn't mature enough. It wasn't ready for prime time. We had to reach hundreds of millions, if not billions of people. So it just couldn't do that. And that's when we resorted to actually going and building our own thing, which was this protocol that was originally called Libra. And the general idea was actually, can we create a real-time settlement protocol for money on the internet? And obviously now, history being a good guide, it was launched from a company that wasn't acceptable to the world government's powers and regulators. And so we ended up failing at shipping this thing because it just wasn't palatable, despite all of the compromises that we had reached to appease regulators' concerns and all kinds of different concerns. So we basically left in December of 2021. I say we, but I left in December of 2021, and a number of other people left either before or after me. But then a group of us still felt very, very frustrated and had this fire to still go try to help build an open protocol for payments on the internet. And so, we took another look at Lightning. It felt like now Lightning was actually more mature, more ready for prime time, still had a lot of issues. So, opportunities to actually go build a business. And so, that's how Lightspark began basically last year.
Wow. Okay. So when did you actually discover Bitcoin? I'm assuming you were already a Bitcoiner when you were
Yeah.
exploring and creating the
Yeah.
Libra project?
Yes. So I started looking at Bitcoin actually fairly early. So, 09, 2010, I started looking at it. And then I kind of dismissed it at the time. I was like, okay, this is way too geeky, way too complicated. I didn't invest the cycles to really understand it deeply. And then it came back to me in 2012, where a very good friend of mine started really insisting that I spent the cycles, and I did. And then my mind was blown. This idea that you could actually move value around the world without any intermediary in between, and that it would work in a total self-sovereign way, was really super, super exciting to me. And so, 2012 was really the year where the light bulb went off, and I'm like, okay, this is something that, I need to invest in, I need to spend time on. And those were the Mt. Gox years, where you had to actually send a wire from the US to Japan, and then your banks had all kinds of red flags, and they would call you. It's like, what the heck are you doing? And so those were the good years of early day Bitcoin for me.
And did you have a crypto journey where you ultimately decided that it is Bitcoin that you want to be focused on? Obviously, you're building it's a lightning company. So how did that work? Did you ever dabble in the other tokens as well and then decide, no, I need to be focused on Bitcoin only?
Yeah, basically that's the journey. And of course I had to go explore and try to understand pros and cons of different chains and different protocols. But ultimately, the whole point of this whole thing that we call crypto or Bitcoin or whatever we want to call it, the whole point is actually self-sovereignty, decentralization, and at the end of the day, and we've learned it, kind of the hard way with the Libra journey as well, Libra DM journey, which is that if you are building from a place that has some form of centralization, then it defeats the purpose. And I'm not a maxi in the sense of, I don't think that everyone should own their keys and be on non-custodial wallets. I think there's a place for both. But the reality of having the option, this escape valve to the current system available to people is why this whole thing matters. And as such, I think that proof of work is actually a much better algorithm for decentralization, because there's no there are no multiple big islands controlling the protocol. It's actually very decentralized in nature, and everything is actually, coded in the algorithm, open for everyone to see. And I think that's kind of a really important feature.
Right. And when you
So, yeah.
sacrifice that energy component of proof of work, then you do have to introduce governance.
Right.
So, I mean, you obviously have experience working closely with regulators. So, how do you sort of explain to people why it's okay that Bitcoin uses energy, why it's so important to keep it decentralized and to make sure that it can be trusted around the world?
Yeah. So, okay. So now that we go on the energy thing, I can go for a bit because this is something
Okay.
that I get very animated about. So,
Okay.
first of all, people just typically don't understand how energy consumption works, or energy production, storage, or lack of storage, and consumption works. So basically, the vast majority of unused energy is dumped into the ground and wasted today. That's number one. Number two is, if you look at the unit economics of Bitcoin mining, it has to tend to zero cost of fractional energy, basically, of residual energy. And the reason for that is just that it's just not going to be profitable for miners to use expensive energy. And it turns out that renewables are actually where the action is, because you can actually go and use the energy that is actually going to be unused at a specific time, or you can go and help fund a new renewable plant that will take a decade to be connected to the grid. And so the whole narrative is upside down. It's actually, Bitcoin will probably prove to be the best accelerant to renewable energy adoption in the world. And the label is exactly the opposite. So I feel like we need to do a better job at explaining this. And I think that there's a political interest in accepting the mainstream narrative that it's bad for energy. But there's also another aspect of it which is interesting, which is, we need to do a better job at explaining what real problem it solves for the world and people in the world. It's hard in America because people have bank accounts denominated in dollars, and they feel like they don't have problems with payments. But that's a very US centric view of the world, and there's no global version of that. And I feel like if you don't believe that Bitcoin is solving problems, then whatever energy you spend on it is pointless, right?
Mhm.
No one argues that Amazon is spending a ton of energy to power AWS, or that Google does that with Google Cloud, or anyone else, right? So the same should be true for Bitcoin, only that it's actually better for renewable energy and for the environment, because it incentivizes adoption of better sources of power. And on the other side, it solves real world problems by enabling a truly decentralized form of digital store of value and better payments now with Lightning. And I think we need to do a better job at explaining that.
It's time for a quick break to hear these messages from my partners. First up, how would you like to earn 100,000 Satoshis? Well, here is your chance. Fold is the best Bitcoin rewards debit card and shopping app in the world. You can earn Bitcoin on everything you purchase, from Amazon to groceries to your Bitcoin conference tickets, with Fold's Bitcoin cashback debit card. And you can win free Satoshis every day, or even play for a whole Bitcoin by spinning the rewards wheel. You can also buy Bitcoin and stack sats directly on Fold and earn even more incentives and rewards. This is a great app to get someone totally new into Bitcoin, and way better than earning airline miles or hotel points. Head to foldapp.com/Natalie, and if you use my link, you'll get 100,000 sats when you sign up for Spin or Spin Plus and spend at least $20 on the card. Yeah, well, that's so well said. And thank you for touching on the energy aspect. Let's dig into that a little bit more. I mean, what problem does this solve? Why is it so critical that our nation's policymakers and that everyone, the working people of the world, understand this protocol and take the time to actually start to accrue some of it?
Yeah, I think that the important part of it, we need to get out, and that's why I like what I like about the bear cycle that we're in. We need to get out of that whole narrative around, Bitcoin, and the whole industry in general is made for speculators, and that's it. That's the only value it accrues. It's the crypto bros. We need to get out of that narrative. We need to get out of that world, and we need to get into the world of, okay, this is actually foundational technology that it was going to bring to bear an open protocol for payments on the internet that will be cheap, interoperable, settles in real time, enables everyone to actually have access to sound digital money. And that will improve and change the lives of billions of people around the world in a really fundamental way. And that's I think why a lot of us are excited to build on top of this technology. It's actually as important as the internet was. And for some people, more important, because it'll give them financial freedom for the very first time in their lives. So I think, we need to spend more time on that, because, the narrative of this is for a group of people who just want to get richer, and it's a waste of energy, a waste of time, is just bad.
I completely agree. Well, it makes me think of your recent tweet that has been getting a lot of attention, comparing it to SMTP. I think for a lot of people, we take for granted that the internet has transformed our lives. We use it every day, but people don't actually know how the internet works. They don't know how email works. They don't really understand IP.
Right.
So if Bitcoin, or rather Lightning, is going to be money over IP, can you kind of break that down? How do you simply relate the two public infrastructures?
Yeah, I mean, so basically, I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about, the internet, and the parallel with, what the internet did to the telcos and for communications, to, what crypto, and more specifically Bitcoin Lightning, will do to money and payments. And so when you think about the telco industry pre-internet, it was basically a group of large companies that controlled access to the network. No consumer had access to the network. No one could build on top of it. And those were the times where, people who only the people who had money could actually communicate in a free, unlimited way. We paid $1 a minute for an international call. We paid 25 cents per text message. And we forgot those days now. Everyone can communicate for free. We have things that exist that are called like Google Maps and other things that enables you to navigate the real world. There's a lot of innovation. There's smartphones. There's all kinds of different things that the internet was a precursor to. And that would have never happened on a closed network. And so, the internet did that for communications. And I feel like Lightning, Bitcoin will do the same for our financial networks, because at the end of the day, one was a communication network, this one is a financial network. But today, when you look at the payment rails, only banks have access to the payment rails. No one can actually build on top of it. Consumers don't have access to the payment rails. And so it limits the ability for people and companies to move value in a free, untethered way globally. And I feel like, it's the ability to unlock that value for the world is going to enable people to have access to sound digital money, to move money in a free and unlimited way. And that will unleash a ton of value for the entire world, I think, and that's something that I made that analogy as a follow-up tweet, actually, which is that, people who were sending and receiving faxes at the time when the internet happened, they were like, oh, it's fine. I can communicate. I can send faxes and make calls. I don't need this internet thing that you're talking about. And I think that a lot of the reactions, especially if you live in the US and you're used to using Cash App and Venmo and all these things, you don't feel the pain of sending and receiving money. But even in the US, you can't send money between Venmo and Cash App. So it's a little bit like you're on Gmail and you can't send an email to any other users that are not on Gmail.
Right. Well, in our financial system, there are so many gatekeepers, and I'm always surprised when I see those graphics that show just how many intermediaries there are. When you go to just buy your coffee, how many companies are actually involved and how much time it takes on the back end for the money to settle. You mentioned earlier that, some of these rails were developed decades ago. Why hasn't there been a change or a revolution? Is it just because the power structure has not been incentivized to change it?
Well, I mean, look at what's happened to almost every project that actually tried to change the status quo. When you think of it, like, Telegram tried a version of it with Ton, and that was stopped. There was Kin at the time, that also was another currency that tried to, like, another crypto asset on top of a messaging app that also tried this, and that didn't work. Our thing that we tried with Libra DM didn't work for the same reason. And so every attempt, either in the US or more global, to change the way that money moves up until this point, have been thwarted by regulators and other players, and so in some cases it was well founded. So in other words, you can't actually build a platform that enables all kinds of money laundering and criminal activity to happen. But that's also a misunderstanding for crypto, and notably for Bitcoin, where you can catch more bad actors on this network than you ever will be on traditional financial networks, just because of the nature of the openness of the network. But I feel like every attempt has been thwarted, and the establishment continues to basically grow stronger because they're not challenged. So there's no competition. And so that's why I often use the internet with telecoms as a comparative point, because I feel like that has changed.
Right.
And it's not like the telcos are gone. They've just redefined where they played and where they added value. And I feel the same, needs to happen. There needs to be more competition for global payments, and there is technology that is at the ready right now, that can solve a lot of problems that are experienced by hundreds of millions of people, if not billions of people, and we just need to, get it out.
Yeah, well, everyone had to adapt to the internet. And I feel like some people, especially younger people who grew up with, devices in their hands, they assume that the internet was just adopted easily. But there was even pushback, in the 90s with regards to the internet protocol, right? Can you shed any light, and are there any parallels with what we're dealing with? Some people refer to, Operation Choke Points. Maybe that's a little bit dramatic, but there have been pushbacks and resistance to open protocols in the past.
Yeah, I mean, openness changes power structures. And so by definition, you're going to get pushback for openness, whether it's openness of communication and information, or openness of money and how it moves around the world. So, I think that it's kind of interesting that we spend a lot of time talking about freedom of speech, but freedom of speech wasn't a thing until the printing press became a thing, and then the internet became a thing, and then it gave a voice to a lot of people who didn't have a voice. And financial freedom is the equivalent, and is as important in my mind than freedom of speech. And so, that the openness of a payment network will change that. Will actually empower people to have a choice of what they do with their money and how they move it, and which institution or no institution they choose to trust. And so the internet had a lot of resistance for the same reasons, and I think we're experiencing the same thing on the money side and value side of the world as well.
Okay, let's simplify Lightning a little bit because Lightning obviously gaining more and more traction. There are more nodes, more numbers of channels, more Bitcoin locked up. So adoption is growing, but I think it can still be very complex, especially for non-technical people to understand. So do you think that's an issue, first of all? And how do we potentially make it easier to understand? And how do you explain Lightning?
Well, I think that the first step is actually not explaining it; it's making it simple, and that's what Lightspark does, and that's what we've been focused on. We picked Lightning because we built this unshakable conviction that an open payment network can only be built on top of Bitcoin, and that if you believe that, then Lightning is the only way that you make it scalable and enable fast, cheap, real-time settlement of Bitcoin. And so what we realized very quickly when we started spending more cycles on Lightning is actually this whole concept of channel-based payment system is very unintuitive. This idea that you need to lock up liquidity in channels, find peers to connect to, then as payment go through your channels, you need to rebalance those channels, otherwise you can't receive or send. This is the type of complexity that actually prevents a protocol to gain mainstream adoption because it's so complicated to understand, to manage, to implement. And so we decided that we needed to spend our cycles and our engineering talent on trying to simplify the whole thing. And that's what we did in the first version of the product that shipped about 6 weeks ago, which is that you basically open an account on Lightspark, you deposit your Bitcoin on your wallet, and then you can send and receive in real time on top of Lightning at a fraction of the cost, of course, of layer one. And it's as simple as that. And then we've built a series of SDKs and tools to enable developers to build Lightning into their product. But you need to abstract that complexity. If you don't abstract the complexity, then no one will use this thing. And that's what we've been focused on. And so, two main products, basically, or, let's say 3 main products, but the first 2 are the ones we shipped 6 weeks ago: Lightspark Connect, the enterprise grade entry point to Lightning, the Predict product that is actually an AI-based model that builds a map of the network, looks at where the liquidity is locked up in channels, and tries to predict whether a payment is actually going to make it to the other side before it actually happens, so that liquidity can be deployed in real time dynamically in the right channels, and payments can be actually sharded into smaller payments and reassembled on the other side. So we do all of that magic on behalf of our clients, so they don't have to worry about transaction success rate, liquidity, how they need to rebalance their channels. And typically, the vast majority of exchanges and wallet operators that we've seen out there and met, they basically looked at Lightning before and they were like, okay, this is way too complicated and it's not worth us actually implementing it because it's just going to require full-time employee just rebalancing and managing these channels and our nodes. So that's what we've been focused on as a first step. We also announced a mobile SDK that enables wallet operators out there to deploy custodial or non-custodial wallets on the Lightning network really easily without any concerns around offline receive, which is also another problem of Lightning, typically if you don't use our stack. And so the goal at a high level is really make it easy to use a real-time, very low cost final settlement network that enables people to move value around the world in a seamless way. So that's what we're focused on. And we picked Lightning, we make it simple. That's the first step. And then, of course, we're going to continue adding more capabilities to the platform.
Well, you answered. I was going to ask specifically about Connect and Predict and SDK, but for someone who is non-technical, can you break down why it's so much cheaper and more efficient on this secondary layer when a lot of people might even be hearing about recently how high transaction fees got on the base layer? So how are you able to solve this problem?
Yeah, so basically the reality is, I see Bitcoin layer one as mass transit network. So think of it as the ocean routes for freight. You need to move really heavy stuff. So you use like large tankers or boats or cargo ships that are moving stuff around the oceans at a very slow, but very secure and predictable pace. And so that's what Bitcoin Layer 1 is going to be used for. Very valuable, high ticket transactions. And increasingly with ordinals, BRC20, and more development happening on Layer 1, it's going to become increasingly true that Bitcoin Layer 1 will be used for settlement of transactions that are really high value and need the finality of being on Layer 1. And then for everything else, basically, you need something that looks like a hyperloop of payments, basically, and that's Lightning. It's the ability for you to move value in real time, Bitcoin in real time, on top of this payment protocol that exists on top of Bitcoin. And the fact that there's just more stuff happening on Layer 1, that the mempool is getting plugged up, that the fees are going up, will drive more adoption of Lightning, because you need to actually move value from one wallet to another in real time. And actually, the problem with Layer 1 right now is that it gets in the way of mainstream adoption of the network for other types of things. I mean, you're never going to go and buy even a digital good with Bitcoin if you have to wait 20, 40 minutes for the transaction to clear. And that's where Lightning can actually come in and solve the problem.
It's time for another quick break to hear these messages from my partners. Next up, I want to share with you about Crowd Health, which is a Bitcoin alternative to health insurance. Health insurance costs are sky high today, and you send your money every month to a massive corporation, and then you never see that money again, even if you don't need a doctor. But if you do need care, you end up having to pay even more out of pocket, especially if you end up as one of the 20% of claims on average that aren't covered. Crowd Health is all about community, and the community crowd funds everyone's healthcare. So if something happens to you and you need medical care, Crowd Health negotiates down the medical bill lower than what insurance would be, and then the community helps you cover it. And in turn, you help cover others' needs, which has been so rewarding. I am so glad I switched to this program. And for more information, you can head to joincrowdhealth.com/Natalie and use promo code Natalie for a discount. I am so excited to share that I have joined Orange Pill app as an advisor. If you haven't downloaded this app yet, you are missing out on connecting with Bitcoiners in your area. The Orange Pill app is building the social layer for Bitcoin and helping to create opportunities for in-person connections and community building. You can create a profile and you will see lots of familiar faces there. And then you can search for Bitcoiners or Bitcoin events based on your location. I am geotagged in my home base, St. Louis, and I'm super grateful because the Orange Pill app has helped connect me with Bitcoiners in my new city. So come join us, download the Orange Pill app, and head to theorangepillapp.com for more information. All right, back to the show. So do you see Bitcoin ultimately more as the store of value and then Lightning as the currency?
Yeah, I think Bitcoin for me, the way that I like to describe things is basically that a Satoshi, which is 100 millionth of a Bitcoin, on top of Lightning is a little bit like a TCP/IP packet for money. So it's the truly decentralized digital form of value, of digital value. It's magic internet money, basically. And then you can move value using that unit of Bitcoin on top of Lightning, and Lightning is the settlement layer, and that's how I like to think about it.
Okay, so recently, SEC Chair Gary Gensler went on camera and said that we already have digital currencies. They are the dollar, they are the euro, they are the yen. We don't need another. It sounds like maybe his stance is changing a little bit on Bitcoin. I know as far as SEC chairs goes, I feel like we've been sort of lucky in a sense because he seems to understand Bitcoin from his MIT lectures. But do you see sort of a battle that's brewing because regulators see Bitcoin as potentially a currency that competes with the dollar?
Look, I think that, if you think of Bitcoin as both, digital gold, basically, and as this little TCP/IP packet that can transport value, then, at least, for the foreseeable future, I think people for the vast majority of countries that are covered by the currencies that you listed would actually like to use their home currencies for payments. for day-to-day payments. They would like to keep using dollars and euros and yens for their day-to-day payments.
Spend your fiat, save your Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. That's actually a good approach, and leveraging the transport network of a fraction of a Bitcoin on top of Lightning to move whatever value you want is going to be the key to mainstream adoption of Lightning. And so that's something that we actually are excited to enable in future evolutions of our product, is the ability for you to actually get into the network with whatever currency you want, transact with Bitcoin, but in some cases for consumers or companies, be completely unaware that you're using that network, and then settle on the other side in whatever currency you want. So, think of it as a true global settlement network for whatever asset you want over time. I think, that's where it's going. And, you've seen Lightning Labs and others working on different evolutions of, Taproot assets and others to enable stablecoins to travel on top of Lightning. And so these types of evolutions of the network are things that we're very bullish about.
I'm kind of curious about the evolutions, because until recently, I thought that Lightning was the only network on layer 2, and now I'm learning about some rivals. So will Lightning be the only way to scale Bitcoin, or will there be others? Will there be competition?
Well, I think there will definitely be competition, and that's the beauty of building on an open network, right? Is that, anyone can come up with a better proposal and, try to implement it. I think, the hard part is actually network effects. The underlying network effects, while nascent and early for Lightning, are still strong. If you look at what's happening on Nostr, if you look at what's happening on, and again, it's small ecosystems right now, but you can see the beginning of network effects really at play here. And so I feel that it's hard to go and replace those early network effects with a new protocol. But that said, I feel like there are new, interesting, promising ideas that are emerging, and we'll see what happens. But I think, the key thing is for us that it's built on Bitcoin. That's kind of the key principle that we're not going to steer away from.
I love that. I was curious from your experience at PayPal and then Facebook, Meta, is there maybe a big learning lesson or two from those experiences that have shaped your conviction about everything being built on Bitcoin in the future?
Well, basically, to me, you need to think about, if you're thinking about the global settlement layer for value, then does that thing actually look and behaves like the internet does for communication and information? And so if that's the bar and you try to replace, Bitcoin with anything else, it just doesn't work. And so is this thing actually looking like the internet? Is it as decentralized? Is the power structure, is the governance structure as decentralized? And I know that people are saying, when I talk about SMTP or the internet, that, different centralized entity have more control over it. But that's not fully true. Like, you can have your own SMTP server, and sure, if Google decides not to send you money or send you email in this case, like, it won't work, but you still have access to the underlying network, and you can still send and receive emails with other people. And I feel like the openness of the network is really what matters. And that's truly what Bitcoin is. You can choose to actually have an account with Coinbase or a centralized exchange, or you can choose to use an uncustodial wallet. You have choice. And that choice of self-sovereignty is basically the value of the network, and the fact that you as a consumer have access to the underlying network is the key thing. And so, that parallel works with the internet. It works with Bitcoin. It doesn't work with a lot of other networks.
David, why haven't some of these big companies like the Facebooks put Bitcoin on their balance sheet? I could have sworn Zuckerberg has goats named Maxi and Satoshi or something.
It's actually Max and Bitcoin.
Max and Bitcoin. There you go.
Yeah.
So why haven't these big companies come in yet? The Amazons, the Apples, Facebook, we're putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet. We'd be over 100,000 right now.
Yeah, I think, there are a number of issues. And, one of them is actually accounting rules. And so those are getting resolved.
Yes.
But accounting rules, FASB accounting rules for large corporations, I mean, you can see MicroStrategy, and I know you've had interviews covering that, but you can see how hard it is for them, and that's the main thing they do, is actually put Bitcoin on their balance sheet, right? So some companies have done it. It's complicated. It's a process that requires a lot of breaking molds for large corporations that are not super comfortable doing that. So when it will be easier, I think they'll do it. I also feel like large companies are just having a hard time wrapping their heads around putting a bit of their treasury in more speculative, volatile assets, because they want their treasury to be safe and sound, and they tend to place it in cash and T-bills, and not on more volatile assets. But I think ultimately with utility, things will change. So more utility, clarity of accounting rules, I think those things will help with more mainstream adoption.
Well, from all of your experience at these companies, you must have friends in all sorts of corporations and in the greater tech space. So are you doing your part to try to orange pill them and send them in this direction?
Well, we're more focused right now, as far as I'm concerned. I'm more focused on friends that don't own Bitcoin, because I feel
Yeah.
like it's a sound strategy to own a small portion of your net worth in Bitcoin, no matter where you are. If you can afford to lose it, then it would be crazy not to own it. And then I think on the other side of it is really around the use cases of practical use cases that can actually be solved by Bitcoin and Lightning. In this case, that's where I'm focusing most of my time.
Yeah, well, I actually wanted to ask one more question about Lightspark. You recently introduced a novel metric, conductivity. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, conductivity is actually something that we started spending cycles on early on, where we realized that the way to find the appropriate peer to open channels with wasn't actually super intuitive. So basically it was like a little bit of a PageRank type of model, where you would actually see another node as being prominent on the network, and as such, you would assume that opening channels with that other peer would be a good idea. And we figured out that actually that wasn't a good metric, because you need to have all kinds of different things or different parameters that inform whether a good channel is going to be open with this peer. And conductivity is a way for us to, like electric current, to try to figure out how conducive a specific node is going to be for a specific type of transaction. And that's a metric that we came up with, that we use internally to enable channel opens on behalf of our clients on our stack.
That's really interesting. Sometimes I think that it's just inevitable. Bitcoin will work and everyone will adopt it. It's slow and then or suddenly then gradually or gradually then suddenly. However, I think that it's important for us to be aware of our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities. It's not a done deal yet necessarily. Can you talk about where we should be focusing our energy in terms of making sure that this does work, that the most people do adopt it, that the negative narratives, the FUD doesn't take over, especially on the policy level? I mean, what are our weaknesses and how can we address them?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because that's one of my pet peeves from, I'm not sure there's one Bitcoin community, by the way, but as far as I'm concerned, I feel like so many people in that community are like, it's inevitable, it's fine. So just, stack sats,
Yeah.
accumulate, Bitcoins, and then the inevitable will eventually happen. And also there's a little bit of, this notion that, you can't really make Bitcoin compatible with the existing world and rails and financial system. So it has to replace it all. So I'm really not in that camp. I feel like, first of all, you can't wait for things to happen. You have to actually really materialize them. You have to work towards a goal, and you have to work really, really hard to actually change the game in such a profound way. It's hard. Change is hard. We talked about how openness versus closedness, there's always tension and resistance. So you have to go fight. You have to go build the right products that are solving real people's problems. And then you have to advocate for change that is going to bring that positive change to the world and many people. And that's why I've decided to focus my time on this, because I feel like you need to push forward, and you can't just just believe that it'll happen and then wait for it to happen. That's just not the way things work.
I'm so glad you said that. It's so true. In the bear market, there's never a better time to build, I
I
think.
agreed. I agreed.
As we start to wrap up, Elon Musk, friend or foe to Bitcoin?
I think ultimately friend,
Okay, why?
because I think that the values of having a global settlement platform, the way that Elon talked about PayPal was kind of a global central database for money.
Mhm.
And if you remove central and make it decentralized, with the learnings that he has in terms of freedom of speech, etc., I think Bitcoin is the only network and asset that matches his worldviews around that. I don't want to speak for him, of course, but I feel like more friend than foe.
I agree. I'm very, very hopeful about that, and that we might see some more Bitcoin candidates in the upcoming election. That's really interesting.
Yeah, no, totally.
Okay, what is your advice to people, whether they're in the space or not? I think there are one thing that I really do like about this community is I feel like it makes people really believe that the future could be better and that they could contribute to it, to making it better. That it could be a more not equal outcome, right, but a fairer competition, a more level playing field that we can all compete in. What are your thoughts on that, and what's your advice to people?
Well, we had this interesting dinner at Bitcoin Miami where we invited a lot of our existing clients and clients to be 20-ish people. And it reminded me of how amazing it is to be building on top of something that, the vast majority of people don't see or don't believe in, but stand for something really profound. In this case, financial freedom, and in this case, trying to push for that. And you can see how people are passionate about this, how it's different than just a job, how it's kind of a life's pursuit, a worthy life's pursuit for many people, because typically a lot of people who feel really passionate about that have a firsthand experience of living in Argentina or in Venezuela or in Turkey, where basically their currencies get manipulated, or the government gets in the way of you keeping the money that you've earned through labor. And people come to this and then they share the values, and then it creates this movement, and we really are a movement, and I feel like building on top of something that is open and that has that movement, that organic movement, is very different than our experience of building something proprietary and closed by necessity at the time when we built Libra and DM, where you have to go convince the entire world of the merits of what you're trying to build, versus you join a community of believers in core values and you go build with them. And so I'm really happy and thrilled to be working alongside everyone else who's actually so passionate about the core values of what Bitcoin will bring to the world.
Well, speaking of core values, why is this mission so important to you personally?
Because I feel like in my first company, what I was trying to do is I was kind of really pissed because you had very large companies that were extracting rent on consumers that couldn't afford it. And this really motivated me in trying to go build an alternative. And so it was a competitive telco and ISP in Switzerland, of all places. And I feel the same way right now. And during the Libra years, we spent a ton of time, even in the US, talking to people who were completely unbanked. And we asked them, why are you unbanked? Is it because you can't afford the fees of the bank? And they're like, no, it's by choice, because we can't afford the unexpected fees that come at a time where we need the money. And as such, we prefer to actually pay 10% to cash a check and have cash in our pockets than to have a bank account. And in the world in general, including in the US, if you're poor, you're paying a tax for being poor, because the system is turned against you, and it favors, it's a deposit fractional reserve banking system. So banks want more deposits, and the way they get more deposits is by attracting the wealthiest clients to open bank accounts. And then if you're not that, then they want to dissuade you because servicing costs for them are too high because of the technology they use, the number of people they have, the branches they have to support, and all of that. And so more competition will enable people who can't afford basic digital money services to have access to these services. And that's also true in the US and definitely true all around the world. And that's also true for people who need to send money back home, who often are the most vulnerable people and who can't afford, sending money and paying 10%, 20% at times to send money back home. And then it arrives days later, and people on the other side of the world have to go to an unsafe place and line up for hours at a cash withdrawal location, and then get mugged half of the time because that's where criminals will wait for you. So all of that, there's a simple technological answer to that. It's like, do what the internet did for communications, the same way that you don't have to send a letter that travels the world in days to arrive eventually, maybe not, to a destination. Today, you can actually, text people on WhatsApp, or text people or email them or send them images, video chat with them. You can do all of these things. We can do the same for money. You should be able to beam money or stream money around the world in real time. And the technology is right in front of us. And we just have to put it together, stitch it together in a way that actually changes the world in a positive way for those people who need it.
That's right. In the space, we say be your own bank, but I've also heard something equally compelling: remain unbanked. You can remain unbanked with Bitcoin. You never have to worry about the fees and the business structure that exists that steals from the poor and gives to the wealthy. It's actually interesting what you said, because my mom's first job when we immigrated here was she was a bank teller. And as she would come home, she would say that, it's the poorest people who end up getting, slammed with fees because they don't make enough to keep enough money in their account to not be charged. And so the wealthy people, they don't have to worry about that because they always have a big balance, and they have a lot of debt because we're incentivized to take on more and more debt. So very, very interesting. David, I've really liked this conversation. Thank you so much. Is there anything else that maybe I didn't cover or I didn't ask you that you really want to share or mention?
No, look, I think this was great. Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad to also talk to your audience, because I know a lot of people are building on top of this network as well, and are also trying to advance the future of this network. So really, really happy to have been on. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I have a lot of newcomers too, and you make it very easy. You break it down in a way that's easily digestible. Where can people find you?
Well, on Twitter, at David Marcus, mainly on Twitter these days, and on Nostr as well. You can find me on Nostr these days.
Perfect. And Lightspark. I'll have the information in the show notes. David, thank you so much. And everyone, thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching the video version of this show. I really want to hear from you. If you have suggestions or guest recommendations, you can email me at natalie@talkingbitcoin.com. Please subscribe if you want more content, and I'll see you next time.